On October 29, 1923, in the city of Ankara, where a new government had operated for 3 years in defiance of the old imperial capital, the Grand National Assembly of Turkey proclaimed the establishment of the Republic of Turkey and elected Mustafa Kemal as its first president, marking the formal end of the Ottoman Empire that had ruled for over 600 years and controlled territory spanning 3 continents at its height. The transformation was not merely a change of government, but a complete reimagining of what the country was, abolishing the sultanate that had existed since 1299, ending the caliphate that had made Ottoman rulers the symbolic leaders of Sunni Islam since 1517, and replacing a multi-ethnic empire built on religious identity with a secular Turkish nation-state that defined itself through ethnic nationalism and Western modernization rather than Islamic tradition and imperial glory. The decision shocked conservative Muslims who saw the abolition of the caliphate as a betrayal of Islamic civilization, alarmed minority populations who would find themselves marginalized or expelled from a state that now defined itself as exclusively Turkish, and surprised Western powers that had spent decades carving up Ottoman territory and had assumed the empire's successor would be a weak client state they could control, rather than a defiant republic determined to assert its sovereignty and reject the partition plans that victorious allies had imposed just 3 years earlier. The name Ottoman came from Osman I, the founder of the dynasty that ruled from approximately 1299 until 1922, building an empire that expanded from a small Anatolian principality to control the Balkans, Greece, Hungary, parts of the Middle East, North Africa, and the Arabian Peninsula. At its peak in the 16th and 17th centuries, under sultans like Suleiman the Magnificent, the Ottoman Empire was one of the most powerful states in the world, controlling key trade routes between Europe and Asia, fielding armies that threatened Vienna and controlled the Mediterranean, and creating a sophisticated administrative system that governed diverse populations of Muslims, Christians, and Jews under a system that granted religious communities autonomy in exchange for loyalty and taxes. The empire was multi-ethnic and multi-religious by design, with Turks forming the ruling military and administrative elite, but Greeks, Armenians, Arabs, Kurds, Slavs, and dozens of other groups forming the population, united not by shared ethnicity, but by allegiance to the Ottoman Sultan, who ruled as both political sovereign and religious caliph, claiming leadership over the Islamic world. But by the 19th century, the empire that had once threatened Europe had become what Tsar Nicholas I of Russia called the sick man of Europe, losing wars to European powers, watching territories break away as nationalist movements created independent states in Greece, Serbia, Bulgaria, and Romania, and falling behind economically and technologically as the Industrial Revolution transformed European states into modern powers, while Ottoman industry stagnated and the military declined. The empire tried to reform itself through the Tanzimat period from 1839 to 1876, attempting to modernize the military, create a modern bureaucracy, and grant equal citizenship to non-Muslims in hopes of preventing nationalist separatism. But the reforms came too late and were implemented inconsistently, failing to reverse the empire's decline as European powers continued taking territory and extending economic control through loans, concessions, and capitulations that gave European merchants and companies special privileges within Ottoman territory. The Young Turk Revolution of 1908 brought reformers to power who hoped to save the empire by creating a constitutional monarchy and modernizing rapidly, but they inherited an empire that had lost most of its European territories in the Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913, and faced nationalist movements from Arabs, Armenians, and other groups who no longer believed the empire could protect them or represent their interests. When World War I began in 1914, the Ottoman government made the fateful decision to ally with Germany and Austria-Hungary against Britain, France, and Russia, believing that German military power would help the empire recover lost territories and restore its position. But the decision proved catastrophic, as Ottoman forces fought on multiple fronts and suffered devastating defeats despite the famous defense of Gallipoli in 1915, where Mustafa Kemal, a young Ottoman officer, led troops that stopped Allied attempts to capture Istanbul and knock the empire out of the war. The Gallipoli victory could not save an empire that was losing on every other front. As British forces advanced through Mesopotamia and Palestine, Russians pushed into eastern Anatolia, and the empire's internal administration collapsed under the strain of total war that consumed resources and manpower the state could not afford to lose. The Armenian genocide of 1915 to 1917, in which Ottoman authorities deported and massacred hundreds of thousands of Armenians who were accused of collaborating with Russia, destroyed any remaining claim that the empire represented all its peoples equally and created international outrage that would influence post-war settlement against Ottoman interests. By October 1918, with Germany defeated and Allied forces occupying Ottoman territory, the empire sued for peace and signed the Armistice of Mudros on October 30, 1918, accepting Allied military occupation of strategic points, including Istanbul, and allowing Allied warships to anchor in the Bosphorus, while the empire's fate was decided by victorious powers who had no intention of allowing it to survive intact. The Treaty of Sèvres, signed on August 10, 1920, represented the complete dismemberment of the Ottoman Empire, reducing it to a small territory in central Anatolia, while Greece received the western Anatolian coast, including Smyrna, where hundreds of thousands of Greeks lived. France received a mandate over southern Anatolia. Italy received the southwest coast. An independent Armenia was to be created in the east, and an autonomous Kurdistan was promised in the southeast. The Ottoman Sultan, reduced to a powerless figurehead controlled by Allied occupying forces in Istanbul, accepted the treaty because he had no choice and no power to resist. But the terms were so humiliating and the partition so complete that Turkish nationalists who refused to accept the empire's destruction began organizing resistance under Mustafa Kemal, the officer who had defended Gallipoli and who now decided that if the Sultan would not resist partition, then a new government must be created that would. On May 19, 1919, Mustafa Kemal landed in the Black Sea port of Samsun, supposedly to oversee the demobilization of Ottoman forces, as instructed by the Allied-controlled government in Istanbul. But instead, he used his position to begin organizing Turkish nationalist resistance to partition, traveling through Anatolia and rallying officers and civilians to reject the Allied settlement and fight for Turkish sovereignty and independence. Kemal recognized that the Ottoman system was finished, that the Sultanate had lost all legitimacy by accepting partition, and that only a new nationalist movement based in Anatolia and fighting for specifically Turkish interests rather than a multi-ethnic empire could mobilize the population and military forces needed to resist the Greeks, French, Italians, and Armenians who were occupying or claiming Turkish territory with Allied backing. In April 1920, Kemal's supporters created the Grand National Assembly in Ankara, establishing a parallel government that claimed to represent the true Turkish nation and explicitly rejected the authority of the Sultan's government in Istanbul, which nationalists viewed as a puppet regime controlled by occupying powers. The creation of the Ankara government set up a dual sovereignty situation where two governments claimed to rule Turkey, but Kemal had the military forces and popular support, while the Sultan had only Allied backing and no ability to actually control events in Anatolia, where the real war for Turkey's future would be fought. The War of Independence from 1919 to 1923 determined whether Turkey would exist as a sovereign nation or be partitioned among foreign powers and separatist movements. As Turkish nationalist forces under Kemal's command fought Greek armies that advanced into Anatolia, backed by Britain and France, battled French forces in the south, and crushed Armenian attempts to establish an independent state in the east through military campaigns that involved mass killings and deportations that mirrored the violence of the Armenian genocide and demonstrated that the new Turkey would be built on Turkish ethnic nationalism rather than the multi-ethnic tolerance the empire had sometimes claimed. The decisive campaigns came against the Greeks, who advanced deep into Anatolia in 1921, believing they could capture Ankara and destroy the nationalist movement. But Turkish forces, commanded by Kemal and his chief general İsmet İnönü, stopped the Greek advance at the Battle of Sakarya in August and September 1921, fighting for 22 days along a river east of Ankara, and finally forcing the Greeks to retreat in a battle that saved the nationalist movement and shifted momentum decisively against partition. The final blow came at the Battle of Dumlupınar from August 26th to 30th, 1922, when Turkish forces launched a massive offensive that encircled and destroyed the main Greek army, forcing the complete Greek evacuation of Anatolia and ending any possibility that the Treaty of Sèvres could be enforced. The Greek retreat turned into a catastrophe as Turkish forces advanced to the coast and captured Smyrna on September 9, 1922, where fires destroyed much of the city and thousands of Greeks and Armenians were killed or forced to flee, as Turkish nationalists completed the ethnic transformation of Anatolia that would make it overwhelmingly Turkish, rather than the multi-ethnic region it had been for centuries. With military victory secured, Kemal moved to complete the political transformation by abolishing the institutions that had defined the Ottoman Empire and creating entirely new structures for the Turkish state. On November 1st, 1922, the Grand National Assembly voted to abolish the sultanate, separating political sovereignty from the caliphate and declaring that political power now rested with the nation, represented by the assembly rather than with the Ottoman dynasty. The last sultan, Mehmed VI, fled Istanbul on a British warship on November 17, 1922, ending the Ottoman dynasty's political rule after 623 years, though the assembly temporarily maintained the caliphate as a purely religious position without political power to soften the shock for conservative Muslims who still revered the institution. The Allied powers, recognizing that they could not enforce the Treaty of Sèvres against Turkish military victory, negotiated a new treaty at Lausanne that was signed on July 24, 1923, recognizing Turkey's sovereignty over Anatolia and eastern Thrace, accepting the abolition of the capitulations that had given foreign powers economic privileges, and establishing Turkey as an independent nation-state on terms far more favorable than the partition that had been planned 3 years earlier. The Treaty of Lausanne also formalized population exchanges between Turkey and Greece that completed the ethnic transformation of both countries, as hundreds of thousands of Greeks were expelled from Turkey while Muslims were expelled from Greece, creating ethnically homogeneous nation-states through forced migration that destroyed the multi-ethnic character Anatolia had possessed for millennia. On October 29, 1923, the Grand National Assembly proclaimed the Republic of Turkey with Ankara as its capital, formally replacing Istanbul, which had been the imperial capital since 1453, but now represented the old Ottoman order that the new republic was determined to replace. Mustafa Kemal became the republic's first president, with a mandate to complete the transformation of Turkish society and create a modern, secular, Western-oriented nation-state that would break completely with Islamic tradition and Ottoman imperial identity. The reforms Kemal implemented from 1923 to 1938 represented one of the most radical social transformations any society has attempted, using state power to force Western modernization and secular nationalism on a population that was overwhelmingly Muslim and traditional. In March 1924, the Caliphate was abolished entirely, ending even the symbolic religious authority the Ottomans had held and declaring Turkey a completely secular state where Islam would be controlled by the government. The same law closed religious courts and placed all mosques under state control, breaking the power of religious authorities central to Ottoman governance. In 1925, Kemal banned the fez and turban and required all men to wear Western-style hats, with police enforcing the law. The hat law seems trivial, but represented a fundamental challenge to Islamic identity, leading to protests in conservative areas that were crushed by military force as Kemal demonstrated that opposition would not be tolerated. In 1926, Turkey adopted the Swiss Civil Code wholesale, replacing Islamic Sharia law with European legal principles that granted women equal rights in divorce and inheritance, banned polygamy, and established secular marriage. The legal transformation extended to criminal and commercial codes, creating a legal system with no basis in Islamic law. The most dramatic reform came in 1928, when Kemal decreed that Turkey would abandon the Arabic script and adopt the Latin alphabet, requiring the entire population to learn a new writing system and making older generations functionally illiterate overnight. The alphabet reform was justified as necessary for modernization and increasing literacy, and Kemal personally traveled teaching the new alphabet, but the change also served to cut Turks off from Ottoman history and Islamic texts, making the past literally unreadable. In 1934, the surname law required all citizens to adopt family surnames, and the Assembly granted Kemal the surname Atatürk, meaning father of Turks. The same year, women were granted the right to vote and hold office, making Turkey one of the first Muslim-majority countries to grant women political rights. The transformation created a modern Turkish nation-state that was secular, Western-oriented, and defined by ethnic nationalism. Turkey built modern infrastructure, created a Western education system, and adopted European cultural norms. Ataturk banned Sufi orders and restricted public religious expression, arguing that Islam must be private and public life completely secular. But the transformation came at enormous cost and created contradictions that haunt Turkey to this day. The creation of a specifically Turkish nation-state marginalized and often violently suppressed minority populations, as Kurds, who formed perhaps 20% of the population, were denied recognition as a separate ethnic group and forced to identify as Turks, with Kurdish language and cultural expression banned, and Kurdish resistance crushed through military force that killed thousands and destroyed villages. The population exchanges with Greece and the earlier Armenian genocide had already eliminated most Christian populations, creating an ethnically and religiously homogeneous Turkey that achieved nationalist goals through ethnic cleansing rather than through the multi-ethnic tolerance Ataturk claimed to represent. The secular reforms alienated religious conservatives who saw Ataturk's policies as attacks on Islam and Turkish Muslim identity, creating a divide between secular urban elites who embraced Westernization and traditional rural populations who maintained Islamic practices despite state pressure. Ataturk ruled as an autocrat who tolerated no opposition, creating a one-party state where the Republican People's Party controlled all political life and dissent was crushed, making Turkish democracy more rhetorical than real despite the Republican constitutional structure. Turkey managed to avoid the fate of Iran and much of the Middle East by staying neutral through most of World War II, only declaring war on Germany in February 1945 when the outcome was certain, and doing so primarily to secure membership in the United Nations and position itself with the victorious Allies. The decision to avoid belligerency meant Turkey was not occupied and retained full sovereignty, unlike Iran, which suffered Anglo-Soviet occupation, and positioned Turkey to benefit from post-war American support, as the Cold War made Turkey strategically vital as a NATO member from 1952, guarding the Soviet Union's southern flank. The legacy remains contested as Turkey struggles between Atatürk's secular vision and Islamic identity, between Turkish nationalism and Kurdish recognition, and between authoritarian modernization and democratic governance. The Turkish military launched coups in 1960, 1971, 1980, and 1997, each time claiming to protect secularism against Islamist threats, creating a pattern where the military acted as guardian of Kemalism. The rise of Recep Tayyip Erdogan since 2002 challenges Kemalist secularism, as he has increased Islamic influence in public life and invoked Ottoman heritage, suggesting that forced secularization never fully erased Islamic identity. Erdogan's Turkey looks increasingly to Ottoman history for inspiration, reversing Kemalist rejection of empire and demonstrating that the 1923 transformation was never as complete as Atatürk hoped. The transformation from Ottoman Empire to Turkish Republic in 1923 represented one of the most dramatic national transformations in modern history, as defeat in World War I provoked a nationalist uprising that destroyed a 600-year-old empire and created a republic based on ethnic nationalism, secularism, and Western modernization. The change succeeded because it was backed by military victory that forced Allied powers to accept Turkish sovereignty, and because Atatürk used authoritarian power to force social transformation. Yet the transformation created contradictions that persist nearly a century later, as Turkey continues struggling to reconcile Turkish nationalism with Kurdish identity, secular principles with Islamic faith, and democratic ideals with authoritarian practices. The abolition of the Ottoman Empire was not simply a name change, but a complete reimagining of identity and society that succeeded in creating a modern nation-state, but at the cost of violence and suppressions that remain unresolved as Turkey debates what it means to be Turkish and whether Atatürk's vision still serves a nation far more diverse and religious than the controlled society he tried to create. If you enjoyed this video, hit the like button and subscribe for more history content covering wars, revolutions, and events that shaped the modern world.